It's now time for us to do a little bit of a deep dive into these LOEs. And so we've heard the commanders talk about the overall plan this morning for the network modernization. Now it's time for us to dive down into those LOEs and see what the difference might be in the four of them that we'll talk about this afternoon. So we're going to go through two sessions. The first session will be LOE 1. And the second session will be LOEs 2 through 4. And we're going to do these back to back. And then we're going to take a little bit of an extended break after that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our team. And again, we're going to talk about the LOE 1 as this first session, Unified Network Overview and Future States. It's going to be Colonel Denise Brown from the Office of the CIOG-6 and Colonel Mark Parker from the Army Cyber Center of Excellence. I could go deep into their bio, but I think it'd be best for us to go ahead and get started.
All right, is this on? Okay, so I want to highlight one thing. We are not mirror images. However, we are a product of the same education system. We both graduated Georgia Southern together about 26 years ago, received our commission the same date. So it's almost surreal to be up here together. And it was really surreal cramming last night to put our slides together. So a lot of these slides you've seen before. However, what we want to do is to do a little bit deeper dive. A quick intro to what I do. I am, as y'all heard before, the Chief of Plans and Strategy for CIOG-6. And what does that mean? It means we're working this thing that you may have heard about, the Holistic Network Strategy. We work very closely with Mission Command and TRADOC, Cyber COE on the Mission Command Network Strategy. We also have these things called governance that falls into our divisions area. So the Army Enterprise Network Council, going back to what General Gallagher was talking about before, as well as the ITOC, the newly established ITOC. Today, I don't plan on discussing much about the governance. However, if you have questions, I will gladly try to field them. The other thing is, as we go through this, what we really want this to be is a dialogue. And so if you have questions as we're going through the slides or comments, please ask us. To give you a brief overview of how we're going to do this, we'll start off kind of addressing from a high level, talking about the convergence. We'll talk about what we're doing to baseline and augment the network. We'll also talk about what this tactical server infrastructure is going to be, and then as well as how we're going to manage it through something called UNO, which is Unified Net Ops. And then the last thing is we're going to really hit on some of these emerging technologies and where we see it going in the future, and that's where we really want industry to help us out as well. So without further ado, we'll go to the next slide. Well, we won't. I'm going to pass it over to Mark to see if he has any opening comments.
No, I would just say I'm a TRADOC capability manager. Some of you have mentioned that's the old TISM, TRADOC Services Manager. So I manage the Army's portfolio for networks and services to deliver capabilities to the field. I do that by representing the user community to ASALT and the program community. So primarily that's through requirements documents and requirements documentation. So a lot of the JSIDS documents and processes that we're working through are directly my responsibility. I work those through the proponent for the networks and services, General Morrison. And it's always fun to give a presentation and answer a question when your boss is in the room.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So everyone's seen this in some flavor here in the last day or so. This is really, when you look at this, this is our answer key. So when we're looking at what we need to do as far as this unified net ops, this is the answer key. The chief gave us the answers to the test. Now we have to build the network to meet those answers. And so the biggest ones obviously being those two first principles, the conduct of war and preparation of war. And when we go to the next slide, we'll kind of hit on the planes that we're following, the prep of war and conduct of war falls into. Mark, did you want to add anything else to this one?
I was just going to say the challenge that we have is to take this through every single thing we do. So this is the lens, this is the filter that we are trying to look at every single thing we're doing through. And primarily from my perspective from the requirements process. And you heard General Mingus talk about complexity. You know, every time I watch a movie that involves rocket scientists, they're not on the rocket. But yet we've built systems that require the rocket scientist to be on the rocket. We've got to move that complexity back away. back behind the curtain, back in the laboratory where it needs to be. We've got to become more simple and intuitive. And that's just one example of one of the things we're looking at as we look across all the things we're doing, is to take this very clear guidance from the chief, and I will tell a short work story. I was his Brigade S6 for his tour in Iraq, and he called me in his office one night. He said, "Mark, I want to talk all the time, everywhere, to everyone." I said, "Got it, boss, just like every other commander I've worked for." And then he said, "The last 4 S6s have been incompetent. Don't be number 5. So I made it here, so far I'm doing okay. But I can see his voice in this thing up there. We've just got to make sure we apply it to everything we do. So it really is the answers to all the tests going forward. So it's great to have that level of guidance from your commander.
Yeah, and absolutely, it's what we anchor ourselves back to. Every workshop we have done since this became gospel, sort of, or the rule of law, this has been a part of. Every brief we have, we always start off with this to remind everyone, this is the anchor, this is what we're aiming towards. So if we can go to the next slide real quick. All right, so everybody has seen this slide. So what I'm going to do is try to take it down a little bit to the next level of the efforts going on to get after this. We've already talked about, Joan Gallagher talked about this portion up here. That being really, when you focus on this is really that enterprise environment. And I know we have 2 screens and I have 1 pointer, so I'll go back and forth, okay? So these are these 2 diagrams here actually started is when I was working for Joan Gallagher, probably back in January last year. And it was really trying to depict what does the network look like today, and then where do we want to go to in the future. So when you look at this network, we've talked about this at great length, talking about the stovepipes. But first, you'll notice that these planes were all separate. So we had this joint plane, this DISA environment. We had the Army plane. And then here being that home station, your base post camps installations, and this being the tactical environment. And when you look here, I don't know how well you can see it, all those little stovepipes reflect the 17. That's just 17 of, I think it's like 65 disparate networks. That only reflects about 17 of them. And then down here, these are the different battle command systems. And so we said, okay, where do we want to go in the future? And this was worked hand in hand with CIO G6, Mission Command, the other mission areas, to say, where do we want to start moving towards? And so that's the one thing I want to highlight. So if you look here, those are those mission areas that were on the pie chart that General Gallagher was talking about. You have your warfighting down here in the tactical space. Then you start moving into your enterprise up here. I, of course, can't see this completely well. Sorry. You have your business, enterprise, and then, of course, the intel. And so, and those may be out of order, and my eyes are being challenged right now, so I apologize. And so those are the mission areas as they apply to those planes across the network. So then when we start going over here to the future state, this is where we really want to get to that converged network. And about, I want to say 4 or 5 months ago, we were doing a workshop trying to focus on this holistic network strategy. And it was actually Mark that said, hey, you know what, I think we're looking at this the wrong way. We have everything being driven by the enterprise down. Why don't we flip that on its head? And that was it's a very valid point. We have been very focused on the enterprise and the enterprise driving the requirements of the tactical network. When in reality, we need to flip that over and say, all right, the tactical network should be driving the requirements of the enterprise. And that is in part because they're also the least common denominator. They're the ones that are going to have the more constrained environment, the more constrained bandwidth. And so that's what we did. And so that's what you're looking over here. That's how this got flipped. And thankfully, Lieutenant Colonel Miller was working architecture for me at the time. And so I just want to throw it out there, though, I don't work architecture anymore, and nor does Terrell. But the team was able to quickly flip the graphic and make that presentation. And so now we start talking about this converged transport. And so the converged transport is, it's more than just the tactical space. We have to start at the enterprise. We have to start at the base post camp stations. And that's what you're seeing here on this, the gold plane there. That's really your home station. That's your base post camp stations. And so we have this effort in the CIO G6 at the enterprise level called network modernization. It's collapsing and consolidating infrastructure. Some of you may have heard of the Joint Regional Security Stacks. That's also part of reducing our attack surface for the network. All infrastructure focused. And then we have transport. And the transport actually goes beyond just the base post camp stations. That goes to what General Morrison was talking earlier, talking about the transport at the tactical edge and combining, collapsing the logistics, the intelligence, everything to ride over one transport. And then when you start looking at the clouds, and this came up yesterday, the clouds. So we are moving towards a cloud environment, but there's other efforts that are going on to get towards that, and that is we have to start with this data center consolidation. We have a significant number of data centers spread across the globe that we have to start consolidating, so then we can start identifying different applications that we want to start moving into the cloud environment and start migrating those applications into a cloud environment. Cloud environment can be off-premise or on-premise. What do I mean by off-premise or on-premise? Off-premise means it could be a commercial provider providing it to us somewhere other than a military installation. On-premise could be it's going to be on a military installation, but doesn't mean it necessarily has to be provided by a government. It could be by an industry partner. And so as you think through that, there's a lot of efforts going on. There's been some stuff going on at Redstone. If you have any questions about or suggestions about how we should be moving towards a cloud environment, we welcome those recommendations. And so you'll notice here we have all these applications down here, and they're split between the DISA cloud and the Army cloud, because not everything's going to be hosted by just DISA or just the Army. Something we don't show, other than the purple cloud there may be instances where we pull it from another service. So that's in the future. But General Gallagher spoke about the tactical space and where we want to start looking at this distributed mission command and these maybe a tactical cloud. And I know that's something that the CFT wants to look at is how do we move towards a tactical cloud? So it's not just at the enterprise level. And when you're in these DIL environments and you get cut off, the tactical space still has their services being provided, and they're not completely reliant and dependent on the enterprise, which they shouldn't be. You've got to be able to operate autonomously, especially in the changing character of warfare and the future environments we're going to be operating in. And so I'm going to pass over to you, Mark, to see if you have anything else you wanted to add.
The only thing I would say is, as we all know, the Army is very old, and so we existed well before networks were developed. And so if you looked at the way we exist today, I don't think anyone would look at that and say that's the network I wanted to be built to get us where we are today. But it is the network we have. Good people making good decisions in the past based on the guidance they had at the time has led us to what we have. And it's worked well enough, but we've got to fix it for the future going forward. And so I think this has got us on the right path. This is, again, just designed to show you some of the complexity that we're dealing with. That's why when you look at some of those installations, Europe, we've been there since World War II. We didn't have any ideas in mind about building networks in Europe back in the 40s, but yet that's the infrastructure we've inherited that we've built on and we built our networks off of. So much work to be done. Not the network we probably wanted, but the network we got, and we'll move to the network we want.
So part of the unified network is to make the PowerPoint a reality. So when March 21st last year, when we briefed this, we presented this to the chief, he acknowledged the fine graphic artwork that had gone into this product, and he also acknowledged that it was PowerPoint deep, and it needed to become, it was not a reality yet. And that included not having the plan fleshed out and everything else. And that's what we have really been working, this team at large that you see, for most of the folks that are sitting in here in uniform have been working this effort. And so with that being said, we'll go to the next slide.
Let me just add just one more thing because it slipped my mind earlier. We talk, and you hear this discussion very often, about building something in the enterprise and taking it to the tactical edge. And so that's part of what we were trying to say by flipping those diagrams, is flip that back around. Take it from the tactical edge. Build it to work in that environment. That is our primary customer. And then work it way backwards, not the other way. Don't build it in the enterprise and try and make it work in tactical. Build it for the tactical and see if it works in the enterprise. You can see what I'm saying. It's just changing your focus on who your primary customer is and who you're primarily there to support. And so that's why the diagram was flipped. That, and I was looking at the slide upside down when I was looking at it. So,
thanks. All right, next slide. Okay, so Mark and I are going to tag team this one as well. There's been a lot of talk. I think a lot of folks have seen this or heard this in different forums, and that is part of the effort in this LOE is how we're baselining and augmenting the network. So the tactical network. So we are baselining the Army with the at-the-halt network, okay, the high bandwidth at the halt. So what we're trying to do is kind of put it in a little bit more plain language. Quite simply put, it's WinT Inc. 1. And then we're also going to complete the fielding of the on-the-move high bandwidth WinT Inc. 2 to select units. And it's going to be our IBCTs and our Stryker Brigade combat teams. The IBCTs are going to get the lighter variant. The Stryker Brigade combat teams will get the heavier variants. In some cases, it will cascade down from IBCTs that were formally fielded with those. And so why does that matter? We still have a lot of work to do. We've still got to continue to upgrade the system, both Inc. 1 and Inc. 2, to be able to mitigate cyber vulnerabilities. But we're also going to eventually move to this next generation transport. And that's where, industry, your ears should be, perking up. What is that next generation transport? Well, that's part of what the CFT is helping us with. And that's part of what they're going to be doing with this experimentation and demonstration is understanding what that next generation transport will be. And then we're going to thicken and augment the network. Now, I'm going to pass this over to Mark because this really falls into his area.
All right. I'll steal the pointer back then.
Yeah, go for it.
So what we're really just trying to say is to operate in a disconnected, intermittent, and limited environment, we need path diversity. We need multiple ways to communicate through multiple spectrum means and through multiple networks. That disconnected, intermittent, and limited can be enemy activities, or in some cases it can be our own activities we do to ourselves. But either way, you may be disconnected, you may be intermittent, and you may be limited. To enable that survivability we need, you need to have path diversity. So we became very overly reliant on SATCOM in the current networks we have. They became very SATCOM based. So one of the things we've looked at very recently with the guidance of General Morris and others is to put diversity back into our networks. So one of the very first things we've done is to reintroduce a line of sight capability back into our formations, back into our tactical formations. Some of you old timers like myself remember Tropo scatter systems. We've actually bringing those back into the force. So we'll push Tropo back into the force to give us another path, another way to communicate. And we'll talk emerging technologies and things we're going to look to help for you on, because I imagine most of you are not using Tropo at this point. But we are going to look for different ways to transition our networks. Mobility, tactical transport. Most of the systems we had required an Air Force aircraft to move. We did not have smaller, lighter packages. We are now beginning to develop smaller, lighter ways to communicate and be mobile. That mobility leads to survivability. In addition to mobility, our command posts are still not wireless, which, if you think about, is just a stunning fact. Anybody in here not using wireless technology? Right, but our command posts are not there. So in terms of survivability and the ability to set up and tear down, the ability to move, we don't have that ability out there. So just this year, we're going to begin to field wireless out to our command posts. General Mingus mentioned earlier the directed requirement to begin to try and put out that kind of capability to enable our command posts to be wireless. And so that's another area we need help from industry. In addition to protected. Right now, the only thing we have in our kit bag for protected satellite is SMART-T, which is the satellite mobile anti-jam resistant tactical terminal. The system is about 20 years old, and we need more options. And so I think one of the other things we're trying to do with industry is ask what we can do to help come up with protected SATCOM, another way to protect our networks to maintain that survivability and mobility. All right.
So a key point about the unified network that we haven't hit on yet is, we've operated in this upper TI, the upper tactical internet, and the lower tactical internet. And as the team of the Geo Trio, was that me or you? That was you? I was like, holy cow. The General Gallagher, Mingus, and General Morrison, when we talk about this unified network, this integrated, one end-to-end integrated network, it also means that we get rid of our tiers. we get rid of the lower TI and the upper TI. We move to more of a heterogeneous transport where the dismounted soldier has multiple paths, as Mark's talking about, multiple transport paths, or the on-the-move unit has multiple paths, that you're not just relying on just that SATCOM. And so that's what we're trying to do is you unify that network, not just end-to-end enterprise to tactical, but it's also about the transport.
We have, I think you turned me off there. We have a lot of ways to communicate. We do. Some part of the issue is whether it's a FM type link, an HF type link, a single channel TACSAT type link, an L-band satellite. We have many different ways to communicate. But across those different communications means we are not stitched together into what we've been terming a unified transport layer so that it just works and that the devices become transmission agnostic so that you don't care, for instance, if most of you have an iPhone, it's a quad band phone. You don't care what band that phone is operating in as long as it operates. So the same thing from our user perspective. You shouldn't necessarily care how your data moves across the network. You just want it to move. And so with that, Denise, anything else you want to add?
Nope.
Next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you about something very briefly called Tactical Services Infrastructure. And so this is a little bit of a complex picture, but it's just each of the computing environments, mobile handheld, command post, mounted, real-time safety critical, sensor. And I did not draw all the lines on there to indicate all the different types of communication there. It was simply just one connection path. What we're trying to say is once we get that transmission layer built and you can move data around, we need to converge what we're doing. And so you need, at each of these locations, common services, and that we're calling common compute and common hardware. And so the idea is right now we have many disparate systems. We need to converge onto a common infrastructure so that we can gain all the benefits we're looking at from this side. Now, why are we doing this? It's about getting the right information at the right time, at the right place to enable commanders to make decisions and lead their formations. So particularly from the industry side, you're very good at this in terms of managing your content and information. You can be in the the handheld environment, and the information you need may need to be on your device. It may be, and this is where, as General Morrison mentioned, this is where we need it to be automated. It may need to reside in a command post. We need help with figuring out how to get the right information to the right location throughout the network. There will be transmission layers there. There are many different paths that information will move. There will be many different types of information at different prioritizations. But what we're trying to say is we need a common idea at each of these locations for common compute, common storage, to manage those common services at each of those locations. It's really for this goal. We've got to get simpler. We've got to get converged. Right now, we are not there. It is way too complex. And so right now, I assume most of you have a Gmail account, Hotmail account, Yahoo account. Anybody know where those servers are? Anybody know where those services reside? You don't. The right content ends up at the right place at the right time for you to be able to use it. All happens below the surface of the water. And that's the same level of services we're looking for here, is that it's transparent to the user. Okay. If you can stitch that transport together, if you can put together the right environment, well, before I transition, let me ask Denise if you have any. Denise, you have anything you want to add?
No.
Okay.
I was trying to find the clanging sound. Squirrel. Sorry.
All right. If you can get the network stitched together, if you can build the right infrastructure to enable that information to be at the right place at the right time, the next thing you need to do, please, next slide, please, is how do you manage that information? And so I've said many times since I became the TCM last summer is, I probably shouldn't say this, I don't really care what technology we field over the next 10 years. The thing I would really like to fix the most is how we deliver networks to our users. And so along those lines, we're working on something called Unified Network Operations, which is really a framework document to stitch together how we do network operations across the military. And so we've built this concept of just being able to weaponize the network, to finally get it so that it can be a weapon system that a commander can employ. And so we developed some requirements from designing and planning. And finally, one of the things I'm a huge fan of, which is modeling and simulating. For many of my years as an S6 or G6 out in the force, I always loved to participate in the war game that we would do as we went through operations and through the MDMP. And so I was always envious of how the maneuver folks could walk through their plan, their actions, enemy actions, counteractions. They would refine and develop and synchronize their plan. And I always thought from the signal perspective is I had no way to do that inside of what I was doing. And so what we're asking for is the ability to model and simulate what we want to do with our networks. Let me plan my network. Let me then take a look at the expected cyber threats for the environment I'm going to operate in. And why can't I model the effects of those cyber activities on my network? And then make changes to my network as I think it may work better. Why not look at the things that I know I'm going to do to myself? I'm going to have generators run out of gas. I'm going to have operators misconfigure things. Why can't I model and simulate those effects upon my network and to make my network more resilient? And use that ability to war game. So that's what we're calling war gaming the network, which is much the same way that the maneuver forces do when they go through MDMP. It's to come up with a better plan. But I don't have that ability. So if you go into most Army networks nowadays, we make configuration changes to live networks all the time without truly understanding the second and third and fourth order impacts of what we're doing. We will push patches, we will make configuration changes, we will change routers, we'll bring links up and down without really understanding what we're doing. And we've got to get out of that way of operating. We've got to get to the ability to virtualize and simulate what we want to do to our network before we actually do it. Then you need to install that network, you need to operate it, you need to maintain it, you need to secure it. And so that's very important for what we're doing. The difference in our networks and our infrastructures, it's not fixed. Our infrastructure changes tremendously. Nodes come up, nodes come down. The bandwidth requirements go up, go down. The links come in, come out. So that's always a very dynamic, always changing infrastructure that we deal with. And so the only way to handle that new environment and these new requirements is through a new process of doing network operations. And so we're trying to develop unified network operations to stitch all that together. And frankly, I think industry does network operations a lot better than we do. We've been making it happen through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over the years, through a lot of smart warrant officers. And frankly, we've got to come up with a better way to do things. And this is where we think there's a tremendous opportunity for industry to help us with doing network operations, virtualization, and modeling and simulation on the networks that we want to create and build. Denise?
You can go to the next slide if you want. You good?
I am. I will highlight the three components of DoDNOPS: cybersecurity, network information, network management, information dissemination, management, and content staging. NetOps and cybersecurity are really about the importance of information dissemination management. You've got to get the right information at the right place at the right time to enable commanders to make decisions and lead their formations. That's what it comes down to, and that's what it's about. So whether it's network operations or services infrastructure, it's about getting that right information at the right place. We don't have the network stitched together from a transport perspective. We don't have the network built from the right data perspective to get that information where it needs to be across a network that we need to build. Okay.
Okay, next slide, please. Right. So this is really about getting some thoughts from industry as well, because this is where a lot of thoughts have been, where we have been thinking in the Army. So you heard John Gallagher mention earlier the secure, but unclassified, secure but not secret. The bottom line is we've got to start looking at classification by echelon. Not every echelon, not every mission requires secret, but they always require secure. And so that's where we're moving. You also have heard both John Gallagher and John Morrison talk about spectrum, and the fact that it's contested, it is congested, more so today than it has been in the last 15 years. And so what we're looking at is how do we get those dynamic spectrum access technologies? How do we incorporate that into our transport means? And so that's going to help us with the global and denied challenges as well, the spectrum challenges. path diversity, Mark hit on that a little bit. Joe Morrison, Joe Mingus, and Joe Gallagher have also talked about it. We're looking at what is that SATCOM technology out there that could help us? We've talked about the low Earth, we've talked about the medium Earth orbiting, but really moving away from the geospatial, having more nodes or more satellites to be able to pull from. And so if one's taken down, you can just quickly hop over to another satellite. And then also talking about leveraging the commercial infrastructure and when that is available to us. And it goes back to the PACE plans that have been discussed earlier today. How do we leverage all these different transport means for a PACE plan? And commercial infrastructure is out there, and how do we start leveraging that? And then, of course, identity access management. There's a lot of creative solutions out there today that we'd be very interested in hearing from industry. And so I'll pass it over to you, Mark, but really at the end of the day, what we want to do is start hearing from y'all, get your questions, and start giving us some thoughts of where you think we should be going.
I'm just going to cut it short and say hopefully the last 10 minutes we can get some questions in.
Yep.
So thoughts, questions, concerns, comments? Sir?
The one thing that strikes me is, there's a couple things. Number one, but the network management tools are something that are going to be more are going to require. The network management tools are going to. Can you hear me? The network management tools are going to require a set of capabilities. Probably more complex than we've ever had to deal with before. When you're dealing, and then the other thing that is we talk about the ability to scale, we're talking probably about software systems. And it's going to be very important to not gaff off the security aspect of that.
Sure.
Because that, and what is the pedigree of the software that is being used to build those radios and those networks, particularly when you get into routers and servers and things of that nature.
Sure, I think our networks should do nothing but get more complex. And I think the way industry has the ability to scale for particular events, if you look at the Super Bowl or a Final Four, the way they have the ability to scale the networks up and down, I think they have some tremendous solutions with scalability. But our networks are going to do nothing but get more complex. We're just continuing to add to the network every single day.
You're going to be moving
sure.
CPs and headquarters, something that's really going to, you're going to be targeted, that RF signatures.
Sure.
You're going to have to move very, very quickly.
Which is sort of General Morrison's point earlier, it's really got to become automated. We are not going to be able to think fast enough to make those network decisions. We have got to get the ability to automate that into what we're doing.
And if I could, one final comment. I don't know what's being done in terms of antenna technology. When you're talking about putting different waveforms into different radios, into a single radio, there's some physics that are involved there in optimizing the antenna. I just don't know where that antenna technology is going. It might be something that somebody out here is working on or needs to work on.
So it is absolutely rocket science. I mean, we joke about it, but what we're doing in the world of technology today, it absolutely is rocket science. As I just said earlier, we just can't put the rocket scientist on the rocket. They got to be back in the labs. Automate complexity and operate simply.
If I could go back to your complexity that you raised. So it goes back to what Joe Morrison was talking about, and pulling the complexity up and putting it in the right place, not down with the soldier who's trying to fight and trying to focus on fighting and not focusing on making his comms work or her comms work. It's also about looking at as a service. General Gallagher talked about that earlier. We already do a lot of as a service when you look at, especially in the SATCOM world, and how they support us in it as a service. And it's about how and when and what can we move towards as a service model to also remove some of that complexity.
Question in the back?
So I just had a quick
it's
question.
the engineer from yesterday.
It is.
So Georgia Southern, saying. Okay.
With JRSS,
business, just saying.
And the ability for users to be able to contact servers without basically hitting the stack. So as you start moving data in a sense that we want to be able to hit everything everywhere. So you have multiple paths, but then you also have multiple copies of your data existing in multiple regions on the Earth, and then you move that data to the edge, does the security stack move down with it too at the edge as well? So I'm no longer having to move my user traffic from the edge up to a stack. I can stay local and actually get local-like cloud services available at the edge. Is that kind of the future plan?
I think what we want is to answer your question, or take a shot at answering your question, what we want is that level of flexibility, is that I can move whatever I need to be in the right location. You know, we do a lot of that now with your devices. If you know you're going to go somewhere and you're going to be disconnected, you will download stuff onto your device. You'll decide, do you want to keep that information local to you or on you? Or you will load something onto your laptop. You will make decisions about where you keep things locally. You've got some of that flexibility. We've got to get that level of flexibility into our networks also, so that you may make the choice to keep a security enclave at a particular location, but you've got the flexibility to do that. So you heard the mention earlier about the Ebola fight in 2014. I was the J6 for that for the first 45 days. That whole operation was fought completely unclassified, and the lead federal agency was not the Army, it was USAID, who, by the way, doesn't have a classified network. So everything we did was in support of them. So we had to completely think differently about how we did things, how we knew data, how we secured things. So the idea of different classifications or security levels, not secret, is absolutely relevant in everything we do. We've just got to get the flexibility into our networks and our data to be able to do that. If that answered the question. Any more? Sure, you're just... Yes, sir. Uh-oh. Yes, sir.
Right now, I keep hearing from... I keep hearing from different TICMs, different PMs. I don't have a requirement for an SBU solution that would allow me to have a classified domain and an SBU domain and share data upward. So one of the things I'd encourage TRADOC to look at is a blanket requirement. Just write one requirement that any TICM could use for any platform, because we get it from AMPV, JLTV, Soldier. All of them have that kind of need, but there's no blanket requirement. If we just had one overarching requirement that any TICM could use, he doesn't have to use it. He just has it and he could use it. It'd be simple.
Well, sir. Sir, I was just going to say, the TSI document that we're writing doesn't mention security classifications. It simply mentions enclaves. So we've tried to go back and look at some of that to take some. I said that, and General Morrison hasn't read the document yet, so it's still in draft. But we're trying to lean away from specifying security classifications and just talk about enclaves. Whether that enclave is secret or secure or unclass, is to put that flexibility into the network. Sir? And again, I caveat, General Morrison hasn't seen that document yet. It's still draft.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Well, sir, I think this document will then trump those things to give you that flexibility. So it's coming through as part of the common operating environment. It should be ready to go out in the next few months, and it should provide that blanket.
So then a PM could say, I have a requirement for
Yes, sir.
installation on my platform.
Yes, sir. That's what this is trying to get at.
But I think that's I'll just chime in. I think that's a great point. Yesterday when we were in the small group, and I'm not sure, sir, if you were in the small group, I was asking for, we talk a lot about requirements and the challenges that the requirements pose to industry. I think that is an excellent vignette to go back to TRADOC about, hey, here's something that we're having challenges with your requirements documents, so you can continue to refine it.
So is that going to be an RDP?
Yes, sir.
Specifically identifies requirements for secure but unclassified?
No, sir. I'm saying I'm writing a document to not specify that. I'm simply going to specify enclaves, not putting classifications into it. So the way we have a colorless core network now that can handle any levels of classification from NSA net down to unclass, we have a colorless backbone. The server infrastructure for services needs to be that colorless in that same manner. So it can handle any security classification for enclave. I think I'm confusing. I do not know, sir.
Security architecture that went through the 3-star GOS to allow us to operate at the secure but unclassed. So that's all resident. So the authority to do what we need to do from an SBU at below the battalion level exists. I think there's the integrated the ITN DR we're working on, which gets at some of the complications that the gentleman was mentioning. No, so from that standpoint, I think we're on the path to do that, and part of that is understanding also the levels of classification associated with the various platforms when you're talking about platform integration. The good thing is, as part of the current SBU architecture, we already have a cross-domain solution for unilateral passing of traffic from low to high. The device itself is actually accredited for both ways, so we've got to work on the ATO to go in that direction. But the platform integration piece is actually very interesting. I was up last week doing a lot of crawling around on AMP-B, on the Bradley, on the Abrams, and the Army, from a decision standpoint, has made some resource choices with regard to elements like maneuver, as an example. So there's existing infrastructure on those platforms from a swap standpoint that easily allow you to integrate. So it's a matter of ensuring that you have the appropriate cross-domain on those platforms to be able to facilitate the multi-domain security aspects. So.
Yeah, so I'm going to go next and talk about COE, but let me just read. So the draft CPCE RDP, Command Post Computing Environment RDP, I think we take the complexity off this, and Ryan, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but we are looking at all of the computing environment RDPs for consistency, but we say, and I had it and I lost it, we talk about exchanging information across domains. Where is it? The CPCE operational capabilities shall be entered and managed in the network by operating within and across formations and computing environments and within all security domains to include mission and partner environment networks. In a document that, as soon as we get the COE ISICD approved, we'll follow on with that. And our team is looking at consistency across what I call the forward-facing or the command post mounted and mobile handheld environments. What that does is that forces him in the command post and the services infrastructure to make that available to me. It makes Ed Barker make that available to me in the mobile handheld, and it makes Lieutenant Colonel Sims up at PM Mission Command forced to do that across the mounted computing environment. So that's written in here, and not just making that up. So that's the kind of stuff we're thinking about. That stuff. Maybe it's not perfect then as we go forward with the staffing, but we're definitely thinking about that going forward.
Sir, you had a question.
You can just stay up here.
Yeah, Scott Boblin from Mobile Reasoning. With the advances in long-range precision strike and electronic support of the near peers, are you guys looking at the issue of trying to minimize, comms transmission or the mission command apps, reducing that footprint, or are you just going to rely more on staying moving, which I've heard the chief talk about before?
So I will just, from my perspective, absolutely looking at low probability of detection and low probability of intercept. We did build a lot of our systems to be on, constantly transmitting at all times. Some of that comes into the bandwidth requirements we have of needing to stay lit up to move those amounts of data. So we've got to find faster ways to move that data. So we are absolutely looking at that because it is a risk. We can be seen, we can be found, we can be targeted. So anything we can do to reduce those vulnerabilities, we absolutely have got to do. Mobility is part of that surviving. That's wireless, back inside talks, let them move faster, harder to be hit. But absolutely anything we can do to reduce those signatures, particularly across the RFS spectrum, we have got to do.
Yeah. So, absolutely reducing signatures. Also, what my boss, Joel Crawford, talks about a lot, and the other folks here at the table, the front table, talk about is, how do we hide in plain sight also? And so that's something that we're going to pursue and interested in. So we recognizing we're not going to always be able to lower the signature, but how do we hide within plain sight of the rest of the spectrum? So,
Colonel Brown and Colonel Parker, we need to wrap it up. I hate to do this because you all are you're demonstrating what an Iron Colonel is doing, and as well as some of the questions that came in from the audience. But I want to. How about a big hand for Colonel Parker and Brown for the system? I want to say we are doing audio taping of the event today, and once we get through unscrambling it, we'll have it out there if you want to listen to some of these questions. We also have the plan that's on the website. We put it on today, so you have a hard copy, but now you've got it on the website that you can work with it there as well. So now, you really are getting an example of what's the underpinning of the senior leadership here and what's driving some of these documents to get into your hands. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next session, which is going to be LOEs 2, 3, and 4. We're going to talk about the common operating environment, which we had a question on just a minute ago, interoperability, and command post, which we talked about a little bit yesterday. So these are 2, 3, and 4. Colonel Mike Ernst, who just met his team this morning, I think, is going to be leading a lot of this discussion. He's going to be accompanied by Colonel Fauci. Colonel Fauci is a UK exchange officer, and he is working security as well as the Director for Interoperability within the Command Directorate. I think you've been introduced to Colonel Ernst before, so without further ado, it's all yours.
Thank you. So I see a lot of people taking pictures of the screen. Are these slides available on the web, through the website, right? So make them available, they're available. Yeah. So thank you. And everything that Mark said about briefing in front of your boss is perfect and actually magnified because I'm actually trying to use his slides, so that ought to be interesting. And as Mark talked about separating the rocket scientist from the rocket, I feel sometimes like I'm the goat or the dog or whatever it was that went up in the first rocket. So that's what you're dealing with, Mark, is that's what you got to work with. So thanks. And I'd just like to start, before I turn it over to Colonel Fauci for some opening comments, is just thank the team of teams that are here. I acknowledge and, in fact, am awed in many cases by the cooperation and knowledge of the people in this room. In some cases, they're my direct predecessors, right? Mr. Kevin Merrigan, right, used to be me, a slightly different title, but as offices change, and, some not in uniform anymore, and even some that are, General Komar would have been my boss a few years ago. And so I don't stand up here with the pretense of knowing all of the answers, and I think that's why the dialogue is so important. And I just wanted to pass on in public forum how much I appreciate the advice and counsel of the people in this room as we go forward. It's our turn on the oars up here in our current positions, but many of you have been there, and we're all still on the ship rowing forward. So one of my partners here at the DA level, kind of like we had Mark and Denise, is up here with me. Colonel Fauci from DAMO SS in G3. Colonel Jay Chapman is also one of our good partners. He is working on preparing for tomorrow. And Mr. Stephen Roscoe, raise your hand, please, Stephen. He's not speaking today, but from CIOG6. So we really do have a team of teams represented up here. Sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Fauci, as I said to those yesterday, the souvenir Brit on the team. Great privilege for me to speak to you this morning. And I stand this afternoon. I stand before you with inherent schizophrenia. Okay? So on the one hand, I'm don't let the uniform or voice fool you, I am a division chief on the U.S. Army staff looking at interoperability from a policy perspective. So all that I am focused on here is what do we do to the U.S. Army enterprise in interoperability. Of course, the other side of my schizophrenia is that I represent a coalition member, and so I see the world differently and through those eyes. And just before we get into the Ernst masterclass, I just want to sort of equip you with the quote that there's nothing worse than fighting alongside allies. The only thing worse is fighting without them. And for all the work that we've done, there is not a moment in the last 100 years that the U.S. Army has gone it alone, anywhere. I just want to leave you with that as I turn back to Mike.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so next slide. Guess what? You've seen this one before. Let me just highlight a couple things specific. I'm going to talk about line of effort 2, which is common operating environment first, then talk about command posts, and then we're going to come back to interoperability. So 2, 4, 3. heard it several times that it's worth reinforcing about simple and intuitive, right? We need to reduce the training burden and the retention of information on soldiers, right? So I actually taught how to use CPOF a couple of years ago when I was an instructor at CGSC. I had to teach my class, right? So I went through the classes, a week's worth of training to learn that. I don't even think I could turn it on anymore, right? So we've got to change that. General Mingus talked about flipping the training paradigm from 80 hours, to retain 80% to, hey, let's understand 80% without any training. We'll do some sustainment training. Expeditionary and mobile. This applies to common operating environment and the command post. We understand the need. Many of you in this room will remember, the glory days of the end of the Cold War in the 90s about how we had command posts in 577s and 1068s. It's a similar paradigm we're going to talk to you about, but be cautioned. We're in a multi-domain battle environment now, and it's similar, but be careful about applying the exact same paradigms. But we need to be able to be mobile and scalable and agile so we can meet the threats in the operational environment. Standards-based is absolutely important. We understand now that, as many of you know, PM Mission Command has purchased a program called SitAware, and to use that as the core of the command post computing environment. That represents the first attempt to standardize the software baseline for the Army, and we'll move forward. That doesn't mean it's the permanent solution, but that is their initial foray into standards-based environment. And I attribute much of the challenges that we're going through right now to establishing that standard, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. The OODA loop and being able to decide faster, again, really, really important, and the common operating environment and command posts, as well as the network improvements, are going to help us do that. It's absolutely important. As I'd just like to re-echo what General Mingus said about General Abrams' comment about allowing commanders to lead from where they choose on the battlefield. Right now, commanders, I remember talking to a brigade commander about 18 months ago at a conference, and his division commander had told him he needed to stay in the brigade main CP because that's where he had the best situational awareness. And we were like, wow, really? That, at the time it was true, but, that we just can't be doing that. We've got to give these commanders, Colonel Thompson here and others, the ability to be where they need to be to lead their formations. And we know we need, in the far right-hand column, we know we need secure voice, data, and video at specific times and places on the battlefield. And we've got to have both the applications, the network, and the command post that allow, and the end-user devices that allow that to happen. So let's go to the next slide. So this is, as I think many of you will recognize in the upper left-hand corner, this is what we have right now, right? And no offense to any of the people in here that were part of the development of any of the Army Battle Command systems. If you think about where we went, somebody was talking the other day in the small group session about the revolutions that happened at about 2007 in technology, when we started getting smartphones out to people. If you think about many of these systems, they were developed either then or before then, and individually, they do what we asked them to do, by and large, right? But what's happened over time since then, since these came out, is we've realized the need to take a systems of systems approach. And so we need to move past that, and I think common operating environment is the current vision for how we move past that. So we have these systems that all require some kind of mediation to communicate between each other. They take, right now we have very large server stacks that are cumbersome for the units to both drag around. They sit in the dirt. You've got to connect a million wires. Mark Parker won't let us have wireless. I don't know why that is. And we have to change that, right? And so what we want to move towards is this common operating environment, a suite of web-based applications that communicate using, to the maximum extent possible, a unified data kind of an approach where instead of mediating data between each of their environments or their systems, they are dipping into a common repository of data and information, right? And we want to make those available on an end-user device that's appropriate for the user. So I want to give Colonel Thompson some kind of an end-user device that he can carry with him, whether he's in a command post, out on a patrol, or in a vehicle, that syncs wirelessly when he climbs in a vehicle. So once he establishes his common operating, or his COP, and gets his view of his information the way he wants it, he doesn't have to change it just because he walks into the command post, right? That's what we want to envision with this environment. Let me give you an example. I am not an artilleryman, right? So I'm a tanker. So I'm going to step out of my comfort zone a little bit. But let me use an example of fire support to talk to you about how I see the common operating environment evolving. Because it's perfect. It sits in all of the computing environments, right? We said there was 6 computing environments. And now, as long as I don't do a Governor Perry thing and forget one of the things that so with the command post computing environment, pretty self-explanatory, right? In a fixed structure or a command post where you have access to robust computing and relatively large data pipes. We've got the mounted computing environment, which you would think about that to be in a vehicle, perhaps a helicopter, some other kind of thing where you're on the move and you've got the ability to have pretty good power, and you're not really limited by a bunch of size and weight like you are in the mobile handheld computing environment. Think about that right now as Colonel Barker is leading us with the end user device, like a phone or some other kind of a device like that. Then we have the sensor computing environment. Steve Bynum came up on that earlier today, and the sensor computing environment will fuse sensors from not just within the Army and not just Intel, but across the sensors, whether they be force protection or Intel or even the joint sensors, right? Then we have the real-time safety critical computing environment, which right now is simply a collection of standards, OIS, FACE, and Victory standards, that allow for the information to transfer amongst platforms to be consistent, so that if as we build and integrated platforms going forward, that they can communicate information between them and not have to be mediated. And finally, the enterprise computing environment that will connect those other computing environments with the enterprise that Mark is working on. Okay, so those are our 6 computing environments. So think about if I was a JTAC and I was forward and I saw a target that I wanted to engage with joint fires, right? I'm receiving a video feed that's provided to me through the sensor computing environment on my end user device, right? I see that. I take my PFED and I enter in, I place a call for joint fires, right? Sensor, mobile handheld computing environment. That gets relayed through the network back to a combination of an FDC or a command post where it's in process. Let's say that we choose to fire that mission with rockets, let's say, for example. And we've got that information is being processed through the computing capability that's on our MLRS and fired, right? Mounted computing environment. When it goes to the commander and the staff in the command post, whether it's executed and relayed up through there, or whether it's just monitored and cleared through the command post computing environment. Certainly that, and as you can see, it's tied to the enterprise because that information is going to be replicated in all the appropriate places through the enterprise computing environment. And the systems, the data bus systems that are on the MLRS rocket are compliant with the FACE, OIS, and Victory standards as applicable on that system. So that's the power of the common operating environment. And done right, we won't have to mediate any of that data, right? We won't have to translate that data between any of the different the different communications protocols as it goes between system to system to system. They'll be operating on the same thing. It doesn't happen today, and that's the importance of that. So that's an example. If we go to the next slide, please. That's an example of how the common operating environment would work across the computing environments. What we see here is on the top is we're learning from industry, right? This is kind of speaks to the standards-based idea of the applications that we want to run in a common operating environment. And I don't claim to be a software engineer, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. But I know that from talking to you all, that industry has a set of standards. They say if you want to play in our playground, that you've got to adhere to these standards. You build an application that complies with these standards, you can run in my environment. And so we know that we want to do that. And we want, this is really, really important. As we get to the standard, and as I said, the initial standard will be based on CITAware that PM Mission Command in the Command Post Computing environment is developing. If you have an idea for a warfighting function application that would be useful, you should be able to build that based on the standards that are put out by PEOC3T and PM Mission Command. Build an application. There's been some tremendous discussion today about a place to test that and vet that software very rapidly, which I certainly welcome, and get that out to the soldiers and get it onto the network very, very rapidly. What we see is the migration over time of the warfighting function applications onto the command post computing environment. We know that is going to happen over time. Some of them we believe will come in the first instantiation in 2019 with the command post computing environment and the mounted computing environment, and those are mostly maneuver kinds of applications, right? We're going to take Tiger, we're going to take Geeks A, we're going to take an engineer program called Command Web, and we're going to, all of those capabilities are going to be fused into this first instantiation of the common operating environment. And down the road, we see other warfighting functions. There'll be a fires application, maybe more than that. Maybe there'll be a specific precision fires application, and maybe there'll be one that gives you a more general kind of a capability. Airspace applications. All of these eventually will conform to these standards, and as we move forward, there'll be an opportunity for folks like those of you in this room to rapidly innovate and say, I have what I believe would be a useful warfighting function application that I'd like to see, that I'd like to make available, and it will go, through the process to get made available. And as we've said, the importance of making that available in a format that is usable in the network environment and the physical environment to operate will be very, very important. But this comes back to remember I said simple, and I think it was General Mingus that earlier talked about how commercial applications now build upon themselves over time. We want a very similar look and feel to these applications, whether they're on the end user device, the handheld end user device, the tablet, or the command post. And as the soldier moves from job to job to job, that they will have seen that application exactly or something very similar. So it reduces training time in it, and it speeds retention. Next slide, please. So here's where we are in command posts. So as you know, in the lower left-hand corner, this is the command post that we have right now, our program of record. The SICUPS command post has 5 different components. It's not just the old little 8x8 tents, but it's really optimized for stability operations. It takes a long time to set up. It's really expeditionary because you can break things down into very small packages and put them on planes or helicopters and move them anywhere, but it's not responsive to what we expect the future operational environment to be, in that being very mobile and able to displace very rapidly to counter threats. It's also not really scalable, right? One of the things that General Lundy is spearheading as the CAC-CG was the writing of FM 3-0, the next kind of version of our operations manual, and talks about how we may need to have more than one, maybe 2 TAC CPs that might be deployed, or maybe we need to have a TAC CP forward, a main CP someplace, and a rear area or a support area command post that's controlling operations in a support area. We need a command post, a capability that provides that kind of flexibility. And as Kevin Merrigan asked a question earlier, I wanted to come back to you about the Home Station Mission Command. General Mingus talked about how that was really envisioned to support limited contingency operations, we also need a capability that supports the echelonment of command posts as we deploy into theater. So one of the most important things that I see is a capability, a communications capability that separates from the command post. So when you put your stuff on a boat or a train, you've still got a modular capability that allows you to maintain situational awareness and execute mission command while your stuff is in transit. You fly forward, you meet up with your stuff, and you plug your capability back in, and you're ready to move on and roll. Well, units arrived at this. It's a little bit embarrassing from a TCM perspective because units arrived at this understanding probably before we did, and they started experimenting. In the center, in the white box at the top center of the slide, you see some examples of what units have been doing, right? There's we helped sponsor a mission command on the move Stryker capability a couple of years ago. Units are taking expando vans and shop vans and turning those into command posts. And they're working with all kinds of things. Well, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the Army caught up to that, and the G8 General Murray signed with the Chief Staff's approval a directed requirement that begins a 3-phase command post improvement program. The first phase is, won't repeat everything that General Mingus said, but this is the rapid provisioning, equipping of GOTS equipment to units to allow them to do some prototype, experimentation and assessment at the unit level, figure out what works and doesn't work. For example, we believe that that somewhere between 8 and 10 workstations within a 1087 Expando van is probably the right amount of number of workstations to expect to be used. We can thank some of our partners, such as that happened out at NIE for those who were out there that helped inform that. But the units are going to experiment with those kind of comments, and we're going to come back. We'll put an assessment plan together to inform us about that and to inform our capability development going forward. The second part of the directed requirement is really focused at the brigade TAC and below on formation-appropriate vehicles. So what we see is at the brigade main and above, brigade main, division TAC, corps main, corps TAC, that those would probably be oriented around expando vans and expandable containers, with the mobile command groups being housed in Strykers. Well, at the brigade and below, we want to be formation appropriate so that the enemy can't just see a specific type of vehicle and know that that's a command post. And it also provides the mobility associated with the rest of the formation. So Strykers, JLTVs, or AMPVs is what we're looking at right now. And beginning in 2019, assuming there's no change to our funding profile, PM Mission Command will begin developing prototypes that are informed by Phase 1, some ideas within Phase 1 of the DR, and continue to work on the formation-appropriate kind of vehicles. It's not to say that that's what things will be in the very end, but right now our starting point is JLTVs, Strykers, and AMPVs. And it'll take a little while because we know that AMPV is not going to be available to us till probably 2021 to really begin that prototyping because of the formation. And then the third part is the capability development document that we're currently calling Command Post Integrated Infrastructure. That'll take what we learn from the first 2 phases and we'll actually implement some long-range programs going forward with CPI-2. And who knows what that will look like exactly. The vehicles very well could be JLTV, AMPV, and Stryker, and 1087s and ISO containers. But you would expect to see the competition on vehicles and platforms and that kind of thing going forward. So that's where we are on command posts. In the upper right-hand corner, that yellow block, those are the characteristics, the attributes that we got from the chief and other leaders' guidance about what we need to be. Let me just illustrate an example of the kinds of discussions that we're having right now. We're going to, during Phase 1 of the DR, experiment with this intelligent power solution that reduces approximately 14 generators to 2 pairs of trailer-mounted generators with a little microgrid that connects the brigade main CP. Well, that's a little bit in competition with an idea that says we want to operate the command post in a very dispersed manner where different operational parts of the where we organize the command post either by staff section or by operational function and disperse that to remain, to enable the force protection and security aspects. Well, if you have a microgrid solution with, a 50-meter wire connecting the power cable, that is kind of in contravention for that. So there's another idea about this onboard vehicle power that might come into play and say, well, if we had onboard vehicle power, we could possibly disperse. These are the kinds of discussions we'll have during the experimentation phase of phase 1 of the DR to inform us about that. And who knows, maybe the eventual answer after we prototype and go forward will be some combination of the two or something that we haven't invented yet. The similar thing can be said for the wireless. Right now, the WinT Inc. 1B wireless program provides a bubble, right, that would be used in kind of a fob setting, if you will. Well, we've found out actually you all have found out, some of the experimentation that wireless doesn't penetrate expando vans and ISO containers very well. So now the thought is, how do we go forward with a solution that allows each individual container to be wireless? And then do we rely on the larger network to connect those containers? Or do we have another system that allows the connection of the containers? Those are just some of the kinds of questions that Lieutenant Colonel John Callow and his team are wrestling with as we go forward on the development of the command post. Okay, so and then let's get to the last part, the interoperability. I think I'll just show one of the 2 slides. Yes, sir.
If we hit next slide, I'm just going to give you a break from the Ernst megaphone for a second. And recognizing that I think his boss actually drew this tour de force, so I'll sort of hand over to let Mike explain this. But I think that interoperability is trending right now. And I heard a great phrase earlier about digital native. And I'll be the first to put my hand up and describe myself as a digital nomad. But I've drunk a lot of interoperability Kool-Aid, a lot of it. And actually, it's very personal to me. Afghanistan 2008, I lost on the periphery of a tactical boundary 4 American soldiers because I was unable to communicate with them in a very significant firefight. So I bear that, and there will be others in this audience that have had the same experience downrange. You have got to go through one rebroadcast station to another liaison officer to speak to something floating in the air, or flying in the air rather, to cause the effect that you wish to achieve. Okay, so I declare my bias right now. It's personal. The first thing to get after is interoperability. And we've already heard, so General Mingus gave us a masterclass in terms of joint interoperability, coalition accessibility. But the word interoperability needs micro-definition in its own right. So I could probably take a straw poll of that word in this room right now, and we get at least 20 or 30 different responses. We've already heard in the last 24 hours about cleaning up and being precise with the lexicon. And I think that's something that we all need to get after. The current working definition from the US Army in policy terms is the NATO definition. And I'm going to read it out to you. I had to write it down here because I can never remember it. But the ability to routinely, I say again, routinely act together coherently, effectively and efficiently to achieve tactical, operational and strategic objectives. Okay, that is the authorized NATO definition for interoperability, and it is the current working draft for US Army. But as it refers to mission command and the reason that we're all here, actually it demands greater specificity still. So I go back, interoperability is trending right now, and essentially what we're trying to do here is we're trying to mainstream a cross-cutting issue. It's cross-cutting because aspects of interoperability have implications and effects on other concerns. And because interoperability is quite nebulous, it's quite complex, it's very difficult to decompose into specific things to get after. And if you're a software developer, that can lead to scattering and tangling. And for those of you who are nodding, you're definitely digital natives and not nomads who had to look at Wikipedia just to work out what they meant. So what I wanted to say is that in terms of a policy approach to work out how we are to tune the mission command network to becoming more interoperable, is to recognize, and this is where I'll put my allied or coalition head on for 1 second, is that arguably we were at our most interoperable during Operation Overlord in 1944. Genuinely at our most interoperable. But we had 3 specific advantages on our side. The first was time, the second was training, and the third was that we were unmolested effectively in the rear area. Those 3 advantages we will not have the luxury of today. Now, if you were being facetious slightly, you would say that the greatest act of interoperability will happen on May the 19th when Meghan Markle marries Prince Harry. But I'll leave that for the bar later. But my point is that so interoperability is nebulous. Interoperability is difficult. If it was easy, we'd have solved it a number of years ago. I also think it's recognizing that the US Army has said that it has been or is interoperable in the past, and a guilty admission is that it probably has not been. But what is new and why it is trending is that it needs to be. And it needs to be for a number of reasons. Principally, and just for those of you who have not seen what's happening on the Eastern Front with the Enhanced Forward Presence units now, or in Syria, or in other places of the world, the levels of integration, and when I mean by that, I mean soldiers to soldiers, squad to squad, and in those building blocks, that's happening at levels far lower than we've ever experienced. So hitherto, wind the clock back 20 years, the way we got after interoperability was at the core-to-core level. I'm a kid of the British Army of the Rhine, and you have one BR Corps speaking to V Corps in Germany. That's where you had your interoperability. Great big rectangles and geographic separation. You're the no-fawn guy, sit over there. And that is now not the case. There are US BCTs utterly dependent on, for instance, French artillery, Romanian air defense right now. And our inability to get after becoming more interoperable in mission command systems is having not only a readiness, but also a life impact as we speak. So we've got a problem to fix right now, and we've also got to kind of get to a state of the future as well. Anyway, I'm going to hand back to Mike just to describe the diagram in front of you, because that will get after some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves about levels of interoperability. Mike.
Thanks. Sorry for my long-windedness. I'm not passionate about this at all. So basically, let me take you through very rapidly from the bottom up. We need to make some decisions about what warfighting functions or actual specific tasks within those warfighting functions we want to be interoperable, right? And then we need to talk about what are in what operational environments do we want to be interoperable, right? We, as has been said earlier, there is a tendency to want to be interoperable with us sending a platoon to go train with a Polish company. Is that really where we want to put our Army resources at that level for contingency operations, or do we want to look at large scale contingency operations, or do we want to look at stability operations, those kind of things? We need to take a look at what echelon we need to maximize these at. And it was brought up earlier that many of our partners are not don't have digital interoperability capability below the division level anyway. Some of them go down to brigade level, and very few of them below the brigade. So putting money towards our ability to be interoperable below the brigade or division level is probably not the best use of our money. And then the types of partners that we want to be interoperable with, This is a little bit tricky because all partners are valuable, but some partners we've made more progress with than others because of our historical relationships. And that offers an opportunity for us to learn and apply those lessons to other partners. In other words, the ABCANs, the nations, have done decades worth of work together to develop SOPs and interoperability kinds of standards that could easily be applied to other partners, or at least the lessons learned from those to other partners should we want to go forward. And then this gets back to ultimately how interoperable do we need to or want to be? Fully integrated, exchanging digital information, digital messages. Do we want to be compatible so that we can exchange some but not all information? Or do we just want to be deconflicted, which means we're geographically separated and we're not committing fratricide? So we can go through a lot more discussions about that. Security enclaves also play a part in that. But seeing as how I'm used up all of my time on the other two, and Colonel Fauci has talked about that, I'll leave it at that. Sir, would you like to add anything? That I really went through that, and in opposite order you usually do.
I guess the only thing that hasn't been brought up is, this has now been turned from a cartoon and a slide into a no-kidding white paper, which provides some real recommendations going forward. And working with Joe and his team, we're going to present this tomorrow as part of the formal presentation to General Anderson, and then we need to, like all big ideas, you got to have an implementation plan. And from this, we begin to start to put some people in charge of the various parts of this as it gets peeled back. And this is going to be one of the principal efforts that Pete's going to talk about this afternoon on the digital side. But we got to come up with an implementation plan, which the Army has kind of struggled to previously. So.
Yes, sir. If you go to the next slide, I'm not going to talk about it, but there are some in any kind of detail. But there are some opportunities that we know exist: Warfighter Exercise 18.4, JWA 18.1, and some of these other ideas, CONUS MPE, digital fires. These are some of the most important areas that we know we need to pursue in the interoperability arena that will feed into the implementation plan that General Mingus just discussed.
I think it's also recognizing that, so forgive me just indulging myself and my home nation for a second, but so for the first ever time, a CONUS-based core warfighter has accepted a foreign divisional headquarters to go through that exercise. They're on D+2 right now. So that 10-day exercise, they're on the second day of the exercise. It is very difficult to describe the deep, painful yoga move that the U.S. Army has been in for 9 months to get arguably your closest ally. We didn't burn the White House. You started it. And you invaded Canada. I'm just going to put that out there. But my point is that that assumed level of interoperability has been assumed for far too long. The specificity to place a digitally equipped foreign nation's echelon into a core warfighter, 9 months. I've lost count of the number of starred officers that has required to shove and shunt. And the point here is, how do we institutionalize that and go beyond the episodic? Because we can't afford that time, level, energy, effort as we go forward. So that is a visualization of the implementation plan that General Mingus has spoken to. One of the very real things that was picked at yesterday afternoon were these, it's understanding from an industry perspective those obstacles to becoming interoperable, those obstacles to delivering a faster, leaner, flatter mission command network. Because we know that there are policies out there. I love that word, because every time somebody says there's a policy, I say which policy, which page, which paragraph, which letter, which word. And what I have found in my journey is that it's separating fact from fiction or myth from folklore is one of the most critical things. So the minute you say the word policy, if I'm anywhere near you, I'm going to come and ask you what you mean by that and refer me to the right page. But recognizing that there are some obstacles to this, there are genuine security classifications, what would be very useful, certainly for Mike and I's work, is to understand, so what are the anchors to the ambition that you've heard throughout the day? But on that note, we'll open for questions or being kicked off.
I wish we had time for questions, but I've got to give you a break. But let's give these speakers a great hand. You just cannot put a value on this last hour and a half presentations for those 4 LOEs. You can see the intensity and the desire to be successful through these speakers and this organization, and it's very rewarding to be a part of this. We're going to go into a 30-minute break. We've got snacks through that wall there. Exhibitors would like to spend a few minutes with you. We're going to get started right on time at 2:30. We've got 2 panels and a final keynote, and then we got a great reception right after that. So enjoy your breaks, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes.